Chapter 2. A Fugitive. After a brief burst of speed, Ari settled into a steady pace that he could maintain the entire distance. The only sound competing with the slap of his shoes on pavement was the eerie fluttering of the flags hanging from the dingy shop fronts. Plaster peeling from the once well-kept brick exteriors, and the gray metal storm shutters pulled down and locked tight over doors and windows gave the impression of a city with a history of better days that had been lost even to memory. The gaudy colors and frenetic motions of the flags snapping loudly in the stiff breeze marked the latest trade fair. These twice-a-year events, which were Leipzig's chief claim to fame, brought an influx of visitors, mostly from other Iron Curtain countries. They also brought an astonishing infusion of fancy foods, from caviar to strawberries, that appeared miraculously and briefly in restaurants to impress exhibitors from the West with the benefits of socialism available in this workers' paradise. There was still a surprising number of Western intellectuals naive enough to be taken in by the transparent lie. Ari snorted contemptuously at the thought and slowed his pace to a normal walk until a passing car had overtaken him and sped out of sight. Then he broke into a steady run again. Was this really happening? His legs told him yes, but his head seemed out of sync. It was hard to believe that he was fleeing for his life, that everything he had so passionately worked for over the past 2 years and had come so close to accomplishing was now in the process of disintegration. Faces flashed before him, the individual features of the inner circle of student leaders whom he'd known and loved so well, and with whom he had worked not only in Leipzig, but at universities throughout East Germany, each one a unique personality, full of life. He had recruited and motivated and convinced them that they could win this fight for freedom, and now he felt responsible for their lives. Who would be captured? Would anyone escape? Would he? They had all known the risks. For these young and zealous idealists, the dream of liberating their country had made their otherwise hopeless lives worth living. Were they now to rot in prison, or die, and all in vain? The familiar faces flashing before him became twisted in pain. Interrogation, torture, death. A sob caught in his throat, and Ari quickly turned the sorrow into hatred. He had no illusions about his own fate if they caught him. He would be accused of spying for the West and tortured until he confessed, perhaps in a show trial. They'll never take me alive, never. Marxism has to be stamped out. As he settled into his stride, Ari remembered with anger the raising of the Berlin Wall in 1961. In one incredible night, that infamous structure had slashed its evil scar across the face of the city. He had been ashamed to be favored by a regime that had to imprison its citizens to keep them inside its borders. It had been the final straw for him and tens of thousands of others as well, and it had made his recruitment job that much easier. The fragile spark of hope that had still been flickering throughout Eastern Europe had gone out. An unreasoning fear had swept across East Germany. In the succeeding years, the fear had settled into a despondent resignation. Yet even now, as he ran for his life, the determination was stronger than ever to help his countrymen somehow overthrow East Germany's oppressive regime, and perhaps even others in Eastern Europe. If millions would join together and refuse to move a finger until their demands were met, they could paralyze entire countries and win their freedom. That was the premise upon which he had formulated his plans, and even this present failure did not disprove it. He turned the last corner. The railroad station could be seen a half-mile in the distance. There was no escaping the responsibility he felt. He could never abandon his dream of seeing his homeland once again free. This whole country is a prison. The thought brought a renewed surge of anger. Fleeing to the West, once the hope that kept life in the souls of so many, was no longer a viable option. It was not only the infamous wall that prevented escape. Every inch of the nearly 900-mile East German border with the West had been sealed off completely by a heavily fortified wire mesh fence that was hung at head, chest, and knee level with fragmentation mines that were connected to concealed tripwires. For hundreds of yards back from the fence, the land had been laboriously cleared and meticulously mined. There were steel watchtowers mounted with machine guns and floodlights. Patrolling attack dogs were everywhere on the alert. The few tourist crossings were equipped with heat-sensing devices to detect persons hidden in vehicles or barges. As a result, a palpable hopelessness had settled like a choking fog over the country and people he loved. Even if it had been possible for him personally, the moral duty he felt made any thought of escaping to the West completely out of the question. Yet how could he evade the omnipresent and omniscient secret police and remain inside East Germany? That was the challenge he faced. There was one possibility in Berlin, if only he could get there. The station was now only 50 yards away. Clammy with sweat and gasping for breath, Ari slowed to a normal walk. Approaching the main entrance cautiously, he noticed with relief that there was no sign of police anywhere. The big clock over the door told him that he might have won a place on the Olympic team for those 3 miles. In 7 minutes, he'd be on the 10:49 p.m. train to Berlin. Warily he entered, wiping the sweat from his brow and neck. The large and dimly lit waiting room, with its few rows of worn-out, thinly upholstered chairs and wooden benches, was almost empty, with only a scattering of somnambulant travelers here and there. Ari took in the scene with a glance. There was a nodding mother, her arms around 2 small, sleeping children, and her feet propped onto a stack of suitcases. A drunk, stretched prone and snoring loudly. A middle-aged couple, overworked, underfed, wearing worried expressions, who clung to one another wordlessly. Ari stiffened instinctively. Just inside the door to his right sat an unusually muscular man of medium height, seemingly engrossed in a newspaper. His flattened nose looked as though it had been broken several times, leaving little doubt that he had spent considerable time competing in the boxing ring. On the other side of the vaulted room, next to the exit leading to the platform, a tall, younger man with the look of a finely conditioned athlete was also casually reading the evening propaganda sheets. Both men wore dark business suits. Stasi. Ari stifled the impulse to turn and retrace his steps back out the front door. Where would he go? They had undoubtedly already seen him. Forcing himself to relax, he walked nonchalantly up to the one-ticket window that was open and said in a loud voice, "One way to Fürstenwalde, please." That was not where he wanted to go, but it would misinform his pursuers, and the route would take him past his own village. Ticket purchased, he went through the exit, walked up a flight of stairs and across a set of tracks, then down another flight and on to the Berlin platform. It was now 5 minutes until the next train. Ari walked slowly to his right until he had moved past the last of the few persons waiting for the express to Berlin. Sure enough, the 2 men in business suits, newspapers tucked under their arms, came out onto the platform almost immediately. With the burly one leading the way and the taller one a few paces behind, they began edging in his direction, like cats stalking a mouse. Keeping the right side of his body away from the others on the platform, Ari pulled back his jacket, rested his hand on the Luger, released the safety, and waited. The men stopped about 20 feet from him, unfolded their newspapers, and began to read once again. "They don't want to arrest me now. Just follow me, hoping I'll lead them to others. Okay, we'll see where that game gets us." Ari engaged the safety again, took his hand from the loaded pistol, and let his coat fall forward to cover the weapon. When the train pulled up, he deliberately walked farther along the platform and entered the front door of the last car. The taller man followed him aboard, while the bruiser went on past and entered at the rear. The car was empty, except for an elderly couple sound asleep in the first row. Ari took a seat near the middle of the car. The man who had followed him aboard sat several seats in front of him, and Broken Nose seated himself a few rows behind. "They're so obvious, so overconfident, so used to having it all their own way. Do they think I'm an idiot?" The train started precisely on time and accelerated rapidly, the one public service that operated at something approaching proverbial German efficiency. Ari was thinking fast, going over the alternate possibilities, trying to formulate the best plan. Killing his 2 shadows and throwing their bodies off the train seemed the only plausible solution. Yet he couldn't just snuff out their lives. To do so would lower him to their level. Such an unconscionable act would cost him the moral basis for overthrowing their regime. Self-defense was one thing, but cold-blooded murder was out of the question. He knew he could never kill a man. unless it were the only way to save his own or someone else's life. The conductor, a tall, portly man with a soiled uniform and friendly smile, out of character for any official, no matter how minor, in East Germany, came through to check tickets. That brief task finished, he sauntered back up the aisle, pausing to nod good-naturedly at the sleeping couple. With a wave of his arm, he exited the car on his way toward the front of the train. He wouldn't return until after the next station. Ari could not have the two Stasi agents get off the train with him and follow him to his home, but how could he prevent it? He had to somehow get off the train without their knowing it, or get them off ahead of time. Yes, that was it. In a sudden flash of inspiration, he knew what he had to do. This was an express that made few stops. His own village would be the second one. Ari looked at his watch. He had about 6 minutes. Leaving the precious briefcase behind, he walked casually toward the rear of the car as though he were going to the toilet. Instead, he slipped quickly into the seat behind the burly agent. In one swift motion, he pulled the Luger from his belt and pressed the business end firmly against the Stasi's skull just behind his right ear. "Get up. Now," Ari whispered. "Walk to the front. Hands by your side. Act normal. Try anything and you're dead." Reluctantly, the agent stood up. Ari patted him down quickly, keeping the Luger pressed against his skull. Pulling a snub-nosed .32 caliber revolver from its underarm holster, Ari tucked it into his own belt under his jacket. The man's pockets yielded a handheld, portable two-way radio, a wallet, and a set of keys. Ari took the money, several thousand marks, and dropped everything else onto the seat, covering it with the man's newspaper. Then he shoved Broken Nose out into the aisle. "Hands at your side. Eyes straight ahead. Go to your friend. I'm desperate. Give me an excuse and I'll kill you." The tall, athletic agent, now reading a paperback book, wasn't aware of what was happening until they were a few feet behind him. He whirled around in his seat, saw Ari's gun, hesitated, then raised his hands slowly. Ari shoved Broken Nose forward and motioned for his partner to get up and stand in the aisle just behind him. Swiftly removing the man's revolver, Ari shoved it into a pocket of his jacket. He went through the same routine, removing the money, dropping the wallet and two-way radio onto the seat, and hurriedly covering it all with the newspaper. The elderly couple was still snoring away, swaying with the erratic motion of the train. "I'm a fugitive. No family, no future in this country, determined to escape," Ari told his captives in a low but earnest voice. "Follow orders or you're dead. Through that door, straight ahead." Grudgingly, Broken Nose opened the forward door. Ari shoved the two men through, followed them into the narrow space, and shut the door behind them. The sound of the wheels racing along the track was now deafening, and he had to yell to be heard. "Open that door!" Ari pointed to the exit on the right side. "We can't go out there," objected the taller one, whose long nose, pointed chin, and narrow eyes Ari now noticed up close made him look remarkably like a weasel. "You'll never get away with this," snarled the burly one. "They'll get you." Ari ignored them and glanced at his watch. "In about 1 minute," he yelled, "the train slows for an old bridge over a lake. It's only 3 meters to the water. There's a low railing you can jump over, but there's a support girder every 30 meters. You've got to go between them. Now open the door." The men made no move. Instantly, Ari hit Broken Nose on the side of his face with the Luger, spinning him around. Grabbing him from behind with his left arm around his neck, Ari once again shoved the point of the gun into the base of his skull, just below the right ear, and yelled at Weaselface, "Open the door, now, or I'll kill you both and throw you out." The tall Stasi agent pulled the door toward him and stood in the opening, leaning against the steel wall just inside to keep his balance. Half obscured by clouds, the full moon gave barely enough light to dimly make out close objects as they flashed by. The train began to decelerate. Suddenly, the steady, clattering hum of wheels on track took on a higher, more hollow pitch. "We're over the lake," yelled Ari. "There goes the first girder. When you see the next one, jump fast, both of you. There it goes, jump!" With a shove from Ari, they both went flying out into the night. He heard 2 almost simultaneous splashes. In relief, Ari leaned back against the open door and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Eyes closed, heart pounding, he swallowed the rushing night air into his lungs in deep gulps. The Stasis had landed somewhere near the middle of the small lake. The swim would be short, but the walk a long one. It would take them several hours to reach the closest village. By then, he hoped, he'd be safely in Berlin. Slamming the outside door shut, Ari went back inside. The old couple was still snoring a duet. Quickly, he gathered the objects he had taken from the two men, wrapped them in the newspapers, and threw them out the rear door. Returning hurriedly to his seat, he settled back to catch his breath and contemplate what lay before him. There were some incriminating papers he had to retrieve, backup copies of what he carried in his briefcase. He'd hidden them several weeks earlier in the wall of his tiny bedroom at his parents' house. Among the documents were the detailed plans for the now-aborted uprising and a complete list of names, addresses, and phone numbers of all the key members of the conspiracy. The papers had to be destroyed. He could take no chances, had to do everything in his power to protect the others. His parents wouldn't be happy to see him under these circumstances. He'd have to think of some plausible excuse for his sudden and hurried visit in the middle of the night. They must not suspect that he was a fugitive. When the police questioned them, they had to be able to swear that they knew nothing of his plot or his flight. Otherwise, it could mean prison and torture at the hands of Walter Ulbricht's secret police, a fate he wouldn't even wish upon his father. His mother had often confided to him that the current gangsters were far worse than the Nazis they had replaced. The Nazis had concentrated mostly upon persecuting the Jews and other minorities, but the communist regime mistreated, imprisoned, and tortured everyone. Under Hitler, the country had prospered, even while the rest of the world was in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Germans had never had it so good. Under Marxism, however, the eastern half of Europe's proudest and most affluent nation had become impoverished, inefficient, and incapable of competing with the West in anything except athletics. In order to deceive the world, vast sums that could not be afforded were poured into Olympic sports. Banned drugs were secretly used that enhanced performance over the short term, but that would have devastating effects upon the athletes in later life. Rumors persisted about cancer and other ailments plaguing retired Olympic heroes and heroines. Ari's father took a different view. His fanatical Nazism had metamorphosed with surprising ease into an equally rabid Marxism. For him, the regime could do no wrong, and he lost no opportunity to make his loyalty known. Yet his attempts to curry party favor had thus far gained nothing for him, not even an easing of the harsh and menial tasks he performed at the collective farm. "They'll promote me, you'll see," his father had often told Ari's mother as he drowned his frustrations in alcohol. "Just one rotten Jew on the local committee stands in the way." "He'd turn me in, his only child, to make points with the party. I know it." That distressing realization reawakened a pain long suppressed. How can a father hate his own son? It was a question that had tormented Ari for years, a question he had flung again and again into the silent void as he tossed and turned at night as a young boy not yet in his teens, while vivid scenes from that day's horror or some particularly ugly episode from the past flashed before him. A simple farmer with little education, his father resented Ari's intellect and the fact that he had been chosen for special favor by the party, especially since it involved schooling that took him away from his farm chores for 9 months of the year. Ari's father was a large, powerfully built bully who could turn suddenly violent, especially when he was drunk. His frequent fits of rage had terrified Ari as a child. As far back as he could remember, he had been periodically beaten by his father for no apparent reason. His mother had often shared his fate for pleading on his behalf. Later, when Ari had taken up the martial arts, his fear had turned to contempt. On his 15th birthday, he had defended his mother and himself with a quickness and finesse for which his father's brute strength and barroom brawling tactics were no match. It had been a bloody beating, not because Ari savored revenge, but because his father wouldn't give up until he lay senseless on the floor. There had been no more physical abuse in the home, only looks that would kill, since that memorable day. It would be after midnight when he got there. Perhaps he could slip in and out without being seen. It would have been easier if he and his parents hadn't been forced to move into that rabbit warren of close-packed hovels when most of the farms had been collectivized in 1960. Their neighbors seemed to derive a perverted pleasure from spying on one another, especially that obnoxious family of Jews with the sniveling son and sneaky daughter who always peered from behind their curtains and watched his every move. They had to be paid informants for the Stasi. Where else did they get the extra money that allowed them to have a TV, their own car, and other luxuries that no one else in the commune could afford? Jews, how he loathed that Hebrew breed. Despising Juden was the one thing his father had taught him as a boy that he still retained as a personal conviction. He hadn't known many Jews, but those he had encountered were everything his father had warned him they were, and everything that he despised. Ari would have left home and never returned had it not been for his mother. He loved that good woman with a passion in spite of her foolish religious faith, praying to an imaginary deity who never heard her, crossing herself in a futile attempt to ward off evil, even imagining at times that a prayer had been answered. She was simple and kind, without guile, a relief of sorts in the complex world in which he moved. "Believe in God, Ari, and the good Virgin," she had pleaded with him so often. "You know I'm no atheist like the Marxists," he would protest. "Every atom has its design, and when you come to a living cell and the human brain, of course there has to be some intelligence that planned it all. Call it God if you want." "But Ari," she would remind him, "you never pray." "That's religion, with its rituals and saints invented by some power-hungry charlatans who pretend to speak for God so they can control people. I hate to see you fall for that." "The Blessed Virgin has appeared all over the world," she would reply earnestly. "She promises to bring peace and take us to heaven. I couldn't go on if I didn't have faith." "Faith," he would shoot back, unable to hide his contempt. "Faith in a God who allows disease, starvation, injustice, and Marxist devils to slaughter millions and make us all prisoners? We've got to change the world ourselves. No God will help us." At her pained expression, he would put an arm around her and tell her softly, "I'm sorry, Mama, but really, what evidence?" "Evidence! The church says it's true. Someday you'll understand." It always ended that way, with her faith unchanged and with him regretting he'd been so blunt. It pained Ari deeply to know that his skepticism caused her almost as much grief as his father's abuse. Ari was her only child and the one person she could look to for comfort. He gave it to her in every way he could, but he couldn't pretend to accept the fairy tales she swallowed. How he longed to say goodbye to his mother and to assure her that he'd be okay. If she knew nothing, however, and hadn't even seen him, that might get her some leniency. As for his father, he had no more desire to see him than the devil himself.